Okay, so this video is from an influencer named McMillen, and he claims that the Apostle James did not fully appreciate the Messiah's work on the cross and did not really understand the gospel. McMillen bases this claim on Acts 21. So, to give some context, Acts 21 takes place decades after the Messiah's resurrection, and Luke records that many thousands of Christian Jews in Jerusalem remained zealous for the law of Moses. However, they heard a rumor that Paul was teaching Jewish believers to forsake the law, so James tells Paul to join others in completing a Nazirite vow and to participate in worship at the temple in order to demonstrate that the rumor was false and that Paul himself observed the law of Moses. Luke also records that offerings were to be made for Paul and the others, which would have involved animal sacrifices. McMillan claims that James quote-unquote forced Paul to do these things, which, in his view, demonstrates that James, quote, did not care about the blood of Jesus. Now, before I get into my response, I do want to acknowledge McMillan's consistency here. He has posted numerous videos about why he thinks the teachings of James are opposed to the gospel.
Some of the errors that you'll be taught about James is that it belongs in with the gospel. But it's a turd in the punch bowl. It doesn't fit whatsoever. It stands out. It does not belong with the gospel.
Why does McMillan think that James and the gospel are incompatible? Well, because James clearly affirmed the ongoing authority of the law of Moses in his own letter and in Acts. According to McMillan, Christians cannot mix grace and law. That is, we cannot follow the gospel of Jesus and the law of Moses at the same time. So James is in trouble. Here's McMillan making this argument.
The Judaism that they practiced for 1,500 years is now obsolete. All of it. But James was still taking parts of that and mixing it in with Jesus. It was law plus Jesus. When you read his letter, he is teaching parts of the law. He lists multiple commandments from the law of Moses in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And then he says, you must do this stuff with your faith. You would go cleanse and purify yourself at the temple. Proving that James was still going to the temple, therefore he was trampling on the Son of God, treating the new covenant as unholy.
So, McMillan is simply taking antinomian theology to its logical conclusion. He thinks that Christians have been freed by grace from our obligation to obey the law of Moses, and since James clearly teaches that the law of Moses remains in effect, as we see in passages like Acts 21, McMillan argues that James' teachings undermine the Messiah's work on the cross. Like I said, McMillan is just being consistent. If antinomianism is true, then McMillan would be correct that James did not understand the gospel. Thankfully, most Christians who share McMillan's premise do not take it to this extreme. But in any case, McMillan's conclusion is wrong because his premise is wrong. There is no incompatibility between the gospel and law of Moses. Let's consider the example McMillan highlights, the temple and sacrifices. McMillan claims that James' endorsement of the temple service constitutes a, quote, trampling on the Son of God, referencing Hebrews 10:29. However, that is not what this verse is saying, and ironically, this verse assumes that the law of Moses is valid. The author argues that if rejecting the law of Moses warranted the death penalty, how much greater will the punishment be for rejecting the Son of God? The validity of the conclusion relies upon the premise being true, that rejecting the law of Moses is bad. This argument completely falls apart if the author thought that the law of Moses had been nullified. But setting that aside, the New Testament simply gives no reason to think that the temple service and the gospel are incompatible. In fact, when you just read the end of Luke and the book of Acts, there's no indication that any of the apostles believed that it was wrong to participate in temple worship. This includes Paul, as we will see. When the temple stood, the apostles seem to have just assumed that the laws pertaining to the temple applied and that there was no conflict. For instance, in Luke 24, immediately following Jesus' ascension into heaven, the apostles were, quote, continually in the temple blessing God. We should note that this verse comes right after Luke mentions Jesus opening the minds of his disciples and explaining to them how the scriptures foretold his suffering and resurrection, resulting in the forgiveness of sins. So at this point, the disciples should have had a very good understanding of the significance of the Messiah's work. If sacrificing at the temple was in conflict with the gospel, then why would they be continually worshiping at the temple? This is just not what we would expect if they thought the temple and sacrifices somehow trampled upon the Son of God. As we continue to the book of Acts, Luke presents the apostles attending temple services every day. Why would the disciples attend the temple together every day if the rituals performed in the temple were at odds with the gospel they were preaching? Luke also records that Peter and John attended temple services during the hour of prayer. The hour of prayer refers to one of the customary times of corporate prayer at the temple. What's significant here is that these corporate prayer times corresponded to the daily sacrifices. Again, it seems strange that Peter and Paul would attend corporate prayer at the temple during the exact time when the priests offered the daily sacrifices if they believed those sacrifices conflicted with the Messiah's work on the cross. So, Matt McMillan, if you're going to condemn James, you better be prepared to condemn Peter and John as well. Maybe that'll be your next video. But before you jump on that, you should know that you will also have to condemn your boy Paul, because Paul was very much in agreement with the other apostles. As we discussed at the beginning of this video, in Acts 21, Paul joins others in completing a Nazirite vow and participates in public worship at the temple. Luke records that offerings were made for Paul and the others, which would have involved animal sacrifices. We should note, again, that James told Paul to do these rituals in order to debunk the false rumor that Paul was teaching believers to reject the law. Now, you want to say that James, quote, forced Paul to do this, but there are a couple problems with that idea. First, if we keep reading the book of Acts, particularly the account of Paul's trial before Felix, we see that Paul himself testifies that he fully intended to present offerings to the temple. This was his intention, not something James forced him to do. Second, do you really believe that anyone would have been able to force Paul to do something that he believed was contrary to the gospel? This is the same Paul who, in Galatians, opposed Peter to his face because Peter refused to eat with Gentiles out of fear of the circumcision party. Paul said that Peter's behavior was, quote, not in step with the gospel. So if James had asked Paul to do something that contradicted the gospel or sent a mixed message to other believers, much like Peter's actions did, do you really think that Paul would have went through with it? And yet, he did. Your interpretation makes Paul a massive hypocrite. A better approach is to reject your flawed premise. Contrary to what some have said, you can follow the gospel of Jesus and the law of Moses at the same time. That's what Paul did. James and Paul are in complete agreement. So if you want to condemn James, you'll have to condemn Paul and the other apostles as well. But instead of doing that, again, I would encourage you to reconsider your premise. Maybe James understood the gospel better than you do. By the way, if anyone wants to dive deeper into Acts 21, my publishing company, Pronomian Publishing, recently released a book by Dr. G. Scott McKenzie on this passage. In this book, Dr. McKenzie goes into great detail refuting antinomian interpretations of Acts 21. I encourage you guys to check it out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more content like this, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel. Also, don't forget to hit that little bell so that you'll be notified when new videos like this are released. One last thing, be sure to connect with me on my website, davidwilber.com. There, you can find a ton of free resources like articles and videos, learn more about the books that I've written, and subscribe to my newsletter to ensure you never miss an update. Again, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.